Greetings. This is the one you've known as Jesus the Christ. This is part 2 of chapter 2 of my book, Awakening Love. To forgive those who've harmed you and to heal, 2 things are necessary: letting go of your thoughts about them and understanding that everyone who has ever harmed anyone was identified with the ego and its fear and ignorance. When I said forgive them for they know not what they do, I was referring to those who aren't aware of how their ego manipulates them through the voice in their head. They hurt others and themselves because they don't realize they have a choice around their thoughts and behavior. Instead, they take the path of least resistance. Because your egoic programming is your default, the ego's way of behaving is automatic and feels natural, but it doesn't represent your best self or the best course of action. Most people are sleepwalking through life, not really consciously making decisions, but acting on the impulse of their ego, which leads to very poor results. Those who are operating so unconsciously suffer greatly and cause others to suffer along with them. If you become a victim of their suffering and bad behavior, forgiving them is the only way to unhook yourself from what they're creating. Otherwise, you end up like them, a victim of your own ego. The reason for forgiving others is to free yourself from the state of consciousness that caused the suffering in the first place. Practically speaking, forgiveness is a matter of letting go of any thoughts about the past so that you can be in the here and now, free of suffering, and carry on in love. Forgiveness is not a one-time statement you make to someone, although that can be helpful, but a commitment to not indulging in the painful thoughts that perpetuate negative emotions, that is the egoic state within you. To forgive, you must forget those thoughts. Leave them be when they arise. Don't get involved with them. Living in the now as your divine self does means letting go of such thoughts and staying with your present moment experience. The divine self, and you, when you're aligned with your divine self, feels only compassion for those who suffer at the hands of their own egos and who cause others to suffer. The divine self understands that at this point in their evolution, it can be no other way. They're doing the best they can, and they will learn from their choices. What good would it do to take any other stance? You can only hope that others will forgive you your errors and missteps as well. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's hard to be a human being, as I have so often said, and the situation deserves your compassion. Choosing to be compassionate towards those who have hurt or are hurting you, and then returning to your present moment experience, will allow you to feel the peace and love of your divine nature. Eventually, people do learn from the suffering they cause themselves and others, but that can take a long time. How much better it would be if they understood how they're being manipulated by their own egos and how damaging this is to their relationships. With this understanding, people could evolve much more quickly than through trial and error. There's no need to suffer so much now, since this understanding is available. It's time to become free of the ego. In relationships, the ego shows up as soon as differences or disagreements do, which is what makes loving your neighbor so challenging. The ego has little tolerance for differences unless they benefit it. To the ego, differences or disagreements are a reason for attacking, judging, diminishing, scapegoating, or making fun of others. The ego truly believes that if someone is different from it, he or she is bad or wrong. This assumption of superiority is at the core of most problems in relationships, and when that's the case, The other person often feels the same sense of superiority. Then the disagreement becomes about who is right and superior, not about the actual differences that need to be addressed or negotiated. This superiority tends to get voiced as judgment. Someone looks different, or believes differently, or does things differently than you would like, and you assume something bad about him or her. You tell a negative story about that person, one that is made up by the ego, which is essentially what a judgment is. Judgment is a weapon that is wielded to try to settle differences by claiming the moral high ground. The way this high ground is claimed is through storytelling. I'm not talking about nice bedtime storytelling, but unkind and untrue storytelling. These stories are often disguised as insight, but they're lies because they're based on assumptions. Although there may be some evidence to back up these assumptions, the evidence is often very thin, based on a few experiences, and cherry-picked to build a case against someone. This phenomenon is very familiar to everyone. Look at your judgments. Study them. This is how they work. They are largely assumptions that serve your ego in some way, usually by making you seem smart, insightful, right, or superior in some other way. There is no love in your judgments, even when you pretend to be judging someone out of concern or a supposed desire to help that person. The ego is very tricky. Do not be deceived. Nearly every thought you have about others is a judgment, or likely to turn into one if you think about someone long enough. This is also true in speaking about others when they aren't present, otherwise known as gossiping. Your thoughts and conversations about others may seem purposeful and well-intentioned, but more often than not, they are in service to the ego. The ego knows how to hook you into doing its bidding, into judging, and one way it does this is by getting you to think about others and talk about others. The ego's goal is to sabotage your relationships, except occasionally when the goal is to wheedle its way in with someone who can be of benefit to it. The ego is the worst type of narcissist. It does what it does because it expects some kind of benefit for it. It doesn't do things for love, since love is not one of the things the ego is most after. The ego will take love if love is offered, but love is not the ego's goal as much as other things. The good news is that most human beings are not this taken over by their egos. They are not narcissists. Their divine self shines through some, if not much of the time. Hooray for love! It is actually a powerful force in relationships, more powerful than the ego, or there would be no relationships whatsoever. But it's good to know what you're up against. Some will chastise me for talking this way about the ego, and say I should be kinder toward it. I'm not suggesting that you go to battle with the ego, for that would be the ego going to battle with itself. I'm suggesting that you be aware of the ego and what it's up to, so that you aren't fooled by it and can make better choices about how to behave. Knowledge is power, and I seek to empower you. The ego is not that powerful. It is only ignorance of the ego that gives it power. By all means, accept that you have an ego and that the ego is the way it is. However, you don't need to have compassion for the ego, because it isn't an entity. It's programming. What good is it to have compassion for programming? Have compassion for yourself and others for having an ego, but not for the ego itself. You don't have to love the ego. It doesn't need healing, and it won't be healed by your love and acceptance. The benefit of accepting the ego is that acceptance aligns you with your divine self. Acceptance heals you, while going to battle with the ego will do nothing but keep you involved with it. Love your neighbor as yourself means move beyond any differences between you and your neighbor and love him or her as you would love someone who was just like you, someone with whom you have no differences, which would be no one, since you're the only one in the world that you have no differences with. Everyone else in the world throughout time has been different from you. This is why peace in relationships and in the world is so very difficult. The only solution is to accept and appreciate these differences, rather than make them a reason to put someone out of your heart. If you take the ego's stance that those who are different from you are bad, a threat, or inferior, you'll be at war with everyone, and some people seem to be for that very reason. Those who are very ego-involved have great difficulty loving, and that's why. To the ego, differences are cause for judgment, and judgments close the heart to love. As a result, the ego's world is very lonely. The more involved you are in the ego's perceptions and beliefs, the less love you experience within yourself and coming to you from others. You can only go so far in this direction before something has to give. The suffering of the egoic state of consciousness can be so great that some take their own lives, but that is no solution. The lesson of love still needs to be learned, and that soul will reincarnate and try again to make better choices. There is no punishment awaiting someone who chooses suicide, although suicide is a lost opportunity for the soul and therefore discouraged. That person will receive healing, compassion, and instruction from guides on the other side. Usually, for those who've lost their way, what is needed for them to heal is love. So in the next lifetime, that person may be placed in a particularly loving family, or encounter people or experiences that make the truth about love evident. Punishment is never part of one's lesson plan. Punishment is something humans engage in an attempt to reform someone. But the non-physical beings who serve God by facilitating human evolution do not engage in punishment. It is a poor means of reform. It is cruel, and God is not cruel. God is synonymous with love. To return to the subject of differences, the truth is that differences make life interesting. They are grist for your spiritual evolution, and they provide the soul with a variety of experiences. Not only that, but a society needs diversity to survive and thrive. A society needs all kinds of people with an array of interests and talents. Differences are good. Differences seem problematic because they're problematic to the ego, but they don't have to be if you're able to view them from the divine self's perspective. Differences make the world go around. They're part of life. They make people unique. At best, differences are adorable, and at worst, they must be accepted. From a higher perspective, all differences are superficial and not worth losing love over. Such differences are part of the costume each soul is wearing. What is the same about everyone is of much greater significance. The God force within each of you. That God force, the divine self, is what is lovable about everyone. Love your neighbor as yourself means love your neighbor's true self. What is lovable about yourself and lovable about your neighbor is one and the same, because your essence is one and the same. The great mystery at the core of life is that everything and everyone is an expression of the One, of God. God is manifesting through all life. The same God force is in everything, and that God force is supremely lovable. See yourself, your true self, in your neighbor, and love that. Recognize that your neighbor is essentially the same as you. When two people are truly in love, that God force or essential goodness is exactly what they're in love with. They may love specific things about each other, but the deep and lasting love they feel for each other, which binds them together through any difficulties and differences, is based on the experience of the other as one's own self. When you are with someone for a long time, the boundaries fade, and he or she begins to feel like your very own self, like a part of you. Those who lose someone they've been with a very long time know what this feels like. That is love. Then treating the other with respect and as you would like to be treated comes naturally, although the ego can still rise up at any time. When you experience another as yourself, being with that person is as comfortable as being with yourself, because you can relax. Why is that so? Because the other person accepts you and allows you to be as you are. That acceptance is the essence of love. This brings us to our next chapter and our next exploration. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Thank you for being here. I am with you always.